There's a section in here that you had talked about miracles.
Yeah. A woman blind for 12 years. She married a pastor. And he begins to pray and he says, God, I know you could heal her. I know you could heal her right now. God, I pray, I ask for right now, tonight, that you would heal my wife of her blindness. And she opened her eyes.
So we want to get into, I really want to go into spiritual warfare with you, but this is Christmas. So
Yeah.
Seeing the supernatural.
Right.
And there's a section in here that you had talked about miracles.
Yeah.
And so let's keep it.
Miracles are, to me, it's one of the most fascinating topics, where God will intervene in our world in a way that is unmistakably Him. A miracle is an event brought about by the power of God that is a temporary exception to the ordinary course of nature for the purpose of showing that God has acted in history. So He's intervening. A lot of people said, well, miracles are not possible. This is what I used to think when I was an atheist. Miracles can't happen. Why? Because they violate the laws of nature. You can't violate the laws of nature. David Hume, the famous atheist from Scotland, that was his argument. Well, you're misunderstanding what a miracle is. If I take this cell phone and I drop it, the law of gravity says it's going to hit the ground. But if I drop this cell phone and you reach in and grab it before it hits the ground, you're not violating the law of gravity. You're not overturning the law of gravity. You're intervening. And if God did create the universe, then of course He can intervene at His will in those laws that he Himself created. It's an intervention. He's not overturning anything. It's just an intervention. So I began to look at a couple of questions. How common are miracle claims, really? So I hired a public opinions company to do a scientific poll of American adults. And I asked the question, have you ever had at least one experience in your life that you can only explain as a miracle of God? And 38% of American adults said yes.
No good.
So 4 out of 10 said yes. Now, let's say hypothetically that 99% of them are wrong. They think it was a miracle, it was just a big coincidence. Let's wipe out 99%. That would still mean 1 million miracles just in the United States. So miracles, I think, are more common than we think. And what's interesting is they cluster. They're not evenly distributed around the planet. Where the gospel is just breaking in, places like Mozambique, China, Brazil, that's where we see the miraculous taking place. One scholar said to me, 90% of the growth of the church in China is because someone themselves has had a miracle take place, a healing, or they know someone who it's happened to. 90% of that is the church growth in China. So God tends to intervene in those places where the gospel, and often there's societies that don't have Bibles or anything, but they'll respond to the supernatural that way. So how do we know that it's real? I began looking into this, and Shawn, I found case studies published in medical journals. I'll describe one of them for you. A woman blind for 12 years. She had juvenile macular degeneration, which is an incurable condition. She went to a school for the blind. She learned how to read Braille. She walked with a white cane. She married a pastor, Baptist pastor. One night, they're getting ready for bed. And he comes up to her with tears in his eyes, and he puts his hand on her shoulder. And he begins to pray, and he says, God, I know you could heal her. I know you could heal her right now. God, I pray, I ask for right now, tonight, that you would heal my wife of her blindness. And she opened her eyes to perfect eyesight, saw her husband for the first time. She said, I was blind, and now I see. It's a miracle. She has had perfect eyesight for 47 years. That happened 47 years ago. Been published and 4 researchers researched it, published it as a case study in a secular medical journal.
Wow.
So there's a PhD from Harvard. She's a professor at Indiana University, secular university. She's hearing stuff like this. She says, wait a minute. I'm going to test it. Let's go to Mozambique, where there's supposedly an outbreak of miracles. And she brings a team in. They go into the villages, and they say, bring us all your deaf and all your blind. So they bring people who are deaf, blind, or severely handicapped in those areas. And they tested them scientifically. What is your level of vision? What is your level of hearing? They did testing, and they determined, could you see at all? Or they got it down. Then they were immediately prayed for in the name of Jesus by people who tend to have a track record of God using them in healings. And then immediately after that, they were tested again scientifically. Has your vision changed? Has your hearing level changed? And guess what they found? Virtually everyone improved to one degree or the other. In fact, the average improvement in visual acuity was tenfold. One woman named Martine, when they first met her, could not hear the equivalent of a jackhammer next to her. After 10 minutes of prayer in the name of Jesus, she could hear normal conversations. So they're thinking something's going on here. So they said, let's test it somewhere else. So they went to Brazil, where the gospel is breaking in. They did the same test. They got the same results. This was a scientific study published in a peer-reviewed, secular, scientific medical journal, the Southern Medical Journal, highly respected medical journal. And I interviewed for my book, Seeing the Supernatural, the woman, PhD, that did this. I said, what do you make of this? And she said, this is not some televangelist going in and trying to create an atmosphere of emotion and tricking people and thinking they're feeling better. This isn't trickery. It isn't fraud. She said, all I can say is something's going on. And she's right. I think it's something miraculous.
Wow.
I interviewed a woman. I do the interview in the book. Her name was Barbara. Barbara was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis as a teenager at the Mayo Clinic. Have all her medical records, have multiple witnesses to this. So she goes to Mayo Clinic, she's multiple sclerosis. She began deteriorating rapidly. Over 16 years, worse and worse and worse and worse. Hospitalized repeatedly with lung collapses and things. Finally, her doctors and her parents got together and said, you know what, next time she gets pneumonia, let's just let her die. I mean, this is ridiculous. She's just going to suffer this way. Let's just let her die. So she's in hospice. One lung is collapsed. One lung is at 50%. She's blind. All she can see are shapes, gray shapes. She has a tube in her throat so she can breathe, and it goes to oxygen canisters in her garage so she could be kept alive because she couldn't breathe on her own. She had lost all her muscle tone, hadn't walked in 7 years. She had lost all her muscle tone. Her fingers were so curled up that her fingers were touching her wrists, and her toes were extended like this. She couldn't wear slippers. And she'd lost control of her bowel and her urination. So she's dying. She's in her bed at home. And somebody called in WMBI, which is the Christian radio station in Chicago, and said, hey, Barbara's dying, this woman. Could someone pray for her? Just ask your audience, pray for her. Well, we documented that 450 people began praying for Barbara because we know, because they wrote letters to Barbara saying, I'm praying for you. Pentecost Sunday comes. She's got two or three of her friends there who are reading these letters of people who are praying for her, reading them to Barbara. And out of nowhere, from the corner of the room where there's nobody sitting, she hears the voice of God saying, get up, my child, and walk. So she's stunned. Her friends didn't hear. She said, go get my parents. And she rips the tube from her throat, and she jumps out of bed. So when I'm interviewing her, I said, what's the first thing you noticed? She said, Lee, I jumped out of bed, and the first thing I noticed, my feet were flat on the ground. They'd been curled, they'd been extended for a couple of years, and then I looked, and my hands had opened up. And then she said, the third thing I noticed, I could see. She said, you think that'd be the first thing I noticed? It was actually the third thing I noticed. And her mother comes running in and grabs her calves and said, your muscle tone has returned. Her muscle tone returned to her legs. Her father came in and started waltzing around the room with her. It was Sunday night, Pentecost Sunday, And they went to a Wesleyan church in Wheaton, Illinois. And they said, let's go to church and tell people there's a service that night. So they came to the service. And as they came in, the pastor was up front and he said, does anybody have any announcements? Barbara comes walking down the main aisle. Well, nobody had seen Barbara walk in 7 years. They all knew she was on the verge of dying. And the whole place exploded with people singing, Amazing Grace, I once was blind and now I see. She was instantaneously, completely, totally healed of multiple sclerosis in that instant by God.
Wow.
Totally healed. She had two main doctors. One doctor, she went to see him that Monday. She went to see her doctor. And he said later, when I saw her walking down the corridor, I thought, this must be a ghost. She must have died because this is impossible. This is medically impossible. Two of her doctors wrote books about it because they said, there is no medical explanation for this. I got to know Barbara. We have multiple eyewitnesses. We've got the doctors who knew her and treated her and wrote books about it. We've got records from the Mayo Clinic. She ended up marrying a pastor and had a little church in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.